We are living in interglacial times. For the last 15,000 years we've been living in a period called the Holocene. The previous interglacial period was between 130 and 116,000 years ago. Between the two, we have this vast ice age in which humanity evolved. Glaciers covered much of the world, but starting 15,000 years ago, temperatures began to climb. Civilization and all of recorded history occurred in this warm period, the long summer of the human species. How do we know this? We've got deep sea cores that show the changes throughout time for thousands of years. We have ice cores, such as the ones from Greenland. We have tree rings and their variants. And, of course, we have human historical records, particularly from when literacy came about. And from all of these records we discover how hunters in southwestern Asia took up farming when a 1,000-year cold snap brought drought that ended just as rapidly as it had begun. A 1,000-year chill led people in the Near East to take up cultivation of plant foods. Depending on who you believe, this may have come about in ancient Jericho. They were intensive gatherers and traders, and they built defensive walls. Because the wheat seeds archaeologists have found vary so much in size, it suggests that cultivation was very new, if indeed it had begun here by 8,500 BC. From 13,000 BC to 8,000 BC, Europe became covered in forest, thanks to warming climates and retreating glaciers. This climatic change and resulting alteration in the ecology of the region led to the extinction of the large and medium-sized herd animals that were the favoured prey of Cro-Magnons, our early ancestors, such as the mammoth, the woolly rhinoceros, the giant deer, and the reindeer, and their replacement by generally smaller, dispersed game like red deer, wild boar, etc. Not only did this change in fauna lead to a change in hunting technologies, it also led to an increased reliance on plant food and, in general, much broader diet that included nuts, seeds, tubers, fruit, and fungi. Other changes included increased mobility, and the end of cave art, as tribes and bands were no longer attracted to certain areas, and the development, of course, of the bow and arrow, and much, much more. So immediately we see technology is driven by incentives like climate change. People had to change because their old ways were no longer effective in dense forest against solitary, skittish prey. Jumping ahead to 6000 BC, the settlement of Mesopotamia, agriculture dependent on seasonal rainfalls. So they were very concerned about rainfall and basically had to adapt depending on the rainfall. They couldn't, at this point, become irrigation farmers. That happened around about 5000 BC. The world's first irrigation farmers, the first literate citizens, the cities, urbanization, and a huge population growth there in Mesopotamia. We discover how centuries of much drier climate helped found cities in Mesopotamia and brought cattle herders to the gates of ancient Egypt and eventually nearly toppled the pharaohs. Talking about the city of Ur in what is now modern-day Iraq. Once a great city in one of the world's earliest civilizations, it thrived thanks to the abundant rainfall and then suffered even more severely when the Indian Ocean monsoons shifted southward, changing rain patterns. By 2000 BC, its agricultural economy had collapsed, and today it is an abandoned landscape, an assemblage of decaying shrines in the harshest of deserts. Our author Fagan views this event as pivotal. It was the first time, he says, an entire city disintegrated in the face of environmental catastrophe. 1200 BC to 300 BC, the wealth of Greece, Sicily and Carthage rose to great heights in these years, starting from being near zero. This is a time of warming. Crete, of course, was long since up and running, but we talk about the Minoan warm period, lasted about 200 years, hit us around about 375 BC, and also the Roman warm period of 450 AD approximately, which, well, 250 to 450 AD, let's say. That's what it says here, and I don't really need to tell you about the Greeks and the Romans, do I? And how much they achieved for art and science and literature. I think that's pretty well known. We move along now after that Minoan warm period to the Dark Ages. These were cool times, and I don't think there's much necessity to go over what the Dark Ages were like either. They were cold and not a lot of civilization going, at least in our part of the world. In the West, people were losing the impulse to make durable habitation, so you're not going to find much remaining architecture or sites from those many hundreds of years. The pagan tribes preferred drifting, taking their animals and possessions with them, and that lasted a long time. Coming up then to the medieval warm period, which is approximately 900 to 1300 AD. The world warms again. Half a millennium ago, the Earth experienced a rise in surface temperature that changed climate worldwide, a preview of today's global warming. In some areas, including Western Europe, longer summers brought bountiful harvests and population growth that led to cultural flowering. In the Arctic, Inuit and Norse sailors, i.e. Vikings, made cultural connections across thousands of miles as they traded precious iron goods. Polynesian sailors riding new wind patterns were able to settle the remotest islands on Earth. But in many parts of the world, the warm centres brought drought and famine. Elaborate societies in Western and Central America collapsed, and the vast building complexes of Mayan cities were left empty. Cereal crops were grown in Norway, Iceland. Wine was grown in England, and in fact exported to France. Prolonged droughts to much of the Americas, however, these peoples reacted to the drought by relocating entire communities. Mayan rulers created huge water storage facilities, but their civilization partially collapsed under the stress of repeated multi-year droughts, while the Chumu lords of the coastal Peru adapted with sophisticated irrigation works. Lovely theme there of adaptation versus rationing, although the Mayas took a shot at it, but they were not able to save themselves as the Peruvians were. Now, I'm a little bit short on images when it comes to Mayans and Peruvians, so I've had to improvise with a bit of Indiana Jones here on your screen. As I say, England was exporting wine to France. The vineyards also flourished in impossible, or at least improbable, regions like southern Norway and eastern Prussia. During the medieval warm period, around or shortly before 1200 AD,